Daniel chapter 8 this morning. We have come a long way in the book of Daniel in only 7 chapters, but we've found that in Daniel chapters 1 through 6 we see very many stories, events from the life of Daniel that are given to us that provide us a foundation for 7 through 12, which are prophetic visions of Daniel, really 4 visions in particular. We've come through the first of those visions in chapter 7, and now we come to chapter 8, where we find a second vision. And before we jump in, I want to ask a strange question, but in all of the chapters of Daniel, we find God mentioned over and over and over again. But in this chapter, we don't see God mentioned. We don't see his name. We don't see even the word God in this chapter at all. And I want to ask the question before we jump in, where is God in Daniel chapter 8? Because Daniel chapter 8 is going to describe for us some terrible, terrible events. And yet God's name isn't present. It makes us wonder, where is God when things are terrible, when things are difficult, when things are bad? You know, it's one thing to believe that God is God, that He is sovereign, that He is over all things. It's one thing to say you believe that, but it becomes another thing when we go through trials. It becomes something very different when we're standing at the side of at the bedside of a loved one and we don't know if it's their deathbed or not. It becomes something very different when we have to stand against a tyrannical government that would throw us in prison for being gospel proclaimers. It becomes something very different. It becomes very important that we understand who God is. Is God really in charge of all things? Does He really control all of the universe? Does He really have His hand in every single event that takes place? Can we really trust in God's sovereignty and His control and His ruling over the matters of this earth? I think we can, and I think we do find God in Daniel chapter 8. But let's examine first the first few verses of Daniel chapter 8. Verse 1 says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first." Now, this is the 3rd year, of the reign of King Belshazzar. Now, we remember in chapter 7 that was a vision that Daniel received in the 1st year of Belshazzar. We know, of course, from our studies that Belshazzar was the son of King Nabonidus, who was the emperor of Babylon at the time, and he left his son Belshazzar in charge of the city of Babylon in his absence while he reigned from a city called Tema, some distance away. And Belshazzar, being the regent, if you will, of Babylon, was there probably somewhere 14 or so years until the Persian Empire conquered the Babylonian Empire. So when we read in verse 1 that it was the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, we know this is about 10 or 11 years before they will be conquered by the Persians. This will be important information as we study what these verses mean. So I give this as an introduction. It says that a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel. Notice how surprised Daniel is that he receives this vision. You see, Daniel likes to study prophecy. He interprets dreams. We saw that in chapter 2, and we see in chapter 9 that he's studying the prophecy of Jeremiah. This is something that Daniel does, but for him to get a vision, he's shocked that he got not only 1, 2 or 3 years before this, but now he's getting a second vision. And he's surprised, he's honored at what this means, that he gets to have this revelation. I think there's something that we can derive from that, because while Daniel studied the prophecies and was shocked that he was given a further revelation in a vision, we must remember that we have all of the revelation of God that he wants for us. We've got the Old Testament, we've got the New Testament, we have so much more than what Daniel had. And if Daniel was shocked that he would be the privileged to have this kind of revelation, should we not also see the value in the revelation God has given us? I think sometimes we see these prophetic books as unimportant, but that is not the perspective Daniel had on these visions. He didn't look at this vision and say, "Oh, this is just silly end time stuff, just forget that," He saw this as incredible, that he would have the ability to know this glorious thing that was given to him in this vision. Even unto me, Daniel, he says. Now, it's interesting to note that in the previous vision, in chapter 7, Daniel, when he got the vision, it says that he published it all over the place. But in Daniel chapter 8, it doesn't say the same thing. And in fact, Daniel chapter 8 begins the section of Daniel that goes back to being recorded for us in Hebrew, as far as we can tell. So this part of Daniel was originally written in Hebrew, where several of the chapters before it were written in Aramaic. This appears to be a vision that Daniel recognizes is specifically for the people of Israel, and he writes it not to publish to all the Gentiles, but specifically to make sure that the people of Israel know this. So that's going to be another important thing to keep in mind, because as we look at the vision, we will see that it centers around the nation of Israel. Now, let's continue. In verse number 2, it says, "I saw in the vision." He's going to describe the vision, and it says, "It came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which was in the province of Elam, and I saw in a vision, and I was by the river Ulai." Now, this may seem like just a bunch of words, right? That may not be very connected. It may not sound very important to you, but I want to show you where we can see God in this verse. Verse 2. We're already seeing God in it. Here's the reason. Because remember in Daniel chapter 7, God had given Daniel a vision that predicted the next 3 empires of the world that would conquer and rule over the whole world. And the only 3 empires that would, after Babylon, rule over the entire known world. It was Persia, and then Greece, and then Rome. And Daniel predicted all of that very specifically. In fact, he even used that as proof of the end times things that he said would be coming later. And now, here we have, in verse 2, an amazing revelation. Look what we see here. "I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace." This is the capital city, will be the capital city of the Persian Empire. But Daniel is writing this 11 years before the Persians conquer Babylon. They certainly have it as their capital city. As a matter of fact, at this time, on this year is the year when Daniel is having this vision. It's the same year when Cyrus the Great, the Persian, is conquering. He's currently finishing up his conquer of the Medes. Now, the Medes and the Persians were they were kind of one empire, but the Persians served the Medes. They were sort of the servants. And Cyrus the Great said, "No, I don't want to be the servants of the Medes." And he led a 3-year campaign to conquer the Medes and make it the Persian Empire instead of the Median Empire. Now, this is important because God has already predicted all of these things. We saw this in the previous chapters where one part of the empire would be stronger than the other. Well, here, Daniel is writing this as the Persians are rising to power over the Medes, and he's in Shushan, the palace, which is in the province of Elam. And now look at what he says, "I saw in a vision, and I was by the river of Ulai." Now that is a small river right next to Shushan, the palace. It empties into the Euphrates, as I understand. But it was never called Ulai except during the Persian Empire. So this would not be something that could have been written by someone later. They would never have called it Ulai. This proves that Daniel was writing before all the things he's about to predict happened. We see that God knows the future. You see, God is giving this vision to Daniel, and he's making sure that us, more than 2,500 years later know for a fact, after thousands of years have passed, we can look back and we can still prove that this was written before the things happened. That's God knowing not only the future that's going to happen in the next 10 or 12 or 100 years that we're going to see that's laid out in this prophecy, but also knowing that we need 2,500 years later proof that this was written before it happened. And so he did that. He called it the River Ulai, which is absolutely fascinating because the Greeks had a totally different name for it. It was never called Ulai after the Persian Empire. Verse 3, then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, by the way, apparently Daniel's either physically in Shushan at the time when he gets the vision, or else he's in Babylon and he sees himself in Shushan. He apparently recognizes that it's Shushan because, well, he was a diplomat. He was a very important person in Babylon, so he no doubt traveled on probably diplomatic missions to the Persians, to Shushan. And so he recognizes the place as Shushan. Verse 3, then I lifted up my eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. And I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. And as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came up from the west on the face of the whole earth and touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, and which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground, and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the palace of his sanctuary was cast down, and a host was given to him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. And then I heard one saint speaking to another saint, said unto the certain saint which spake, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And it came to pass, when even I, Daniel, had seen the vision and sought for the meaning, then, behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man. Now, I want you to see verse 15, because as we've read this, you probably had a very similar thoughts going through your mind as what went through Daniel's mind. He says, all right, give me the meaning of this. What in the world is this? He's standing in Shushan, which is at the time the capital of the Persians, who are just now conquering the Medes and becoming starting to become the Persian Empire. And he sees a ram, which, by the way, is the insignia of the Persians. The Persians were known by the ram. That was sort of like the mascot, if you will, of the Persian Empire. They had it on their uniforms or whatever, or on their shields and things like that. The ram. And so he sees a ram in Shushan. That makes sense to him, I'm sure. But he says he is pushing north, and he's pushing west, and he's pushing north, and he's pushing south. And he says, I don't know what that means exactly. And then it says that a goat comes, and this goat has 1 horn. It's a unicorn goat. And it's a really long 1 horn. The goat runs at the ram and kills the ram, and then the goat's horn breaks, and then 4 horns come up out of that, and out of one of those horns, another horn comes up, and that horn and goes on and does all kinds of crazy things for 2,300 days. What in the world's going on? What does this mean? Well, I see God here in verse 15. It says, it came to pass when even I, Daniel, had seen the vision and sought for the meaning, then behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man, and I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. So Daniel's watching this vision. He sees it all transpire, and after he sees this, he starts to wonder what it means. And immediately before him is Gabriel. You know Gabriel from Luke chapter 1. You know, he shows up to tell Zechariah that he's not going to be able to speak because he wouldn't believe that John the Baptist was going to be born. And he shows up to tell Mary that she's going to have a child, the Messiah of the Holy Spirit. Well, here's the first time we see Gabriel. It's in Daniel. And it says that he looks like a man. Daniel looks at him and he looks like a man. This is probably why in Hebrews we read that some have entertained angels unawares, because there are angels that look like human beings. They look like men, but they're clearly angels. Now, what happens here is very interesting, because Gabriel could have just said, aha, I'm here to tell you the answer. But instead, he hears a voice that sounds like a man's voice, coming from between the banks of the river, and the voice says to Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. Now, what appears to be taking place here is that God is telling God, of course, Jesus is the picture here. He's already been called the Son of Man in chapter 7, but here is Jesus Christ who is directing and orchestrating everything that's taking place. All right, time for your vision, Daniel. He's having the vision. All right, Gabriel, get in place, be ready. He's going to need you in a second. All right, the vision's done. He turns, he starts looking for an answer. He sees Gabriel, and then he says, all right, Gabriel, go ahead and give him the answer. He's like a composer. He's like a director of an orchestra, and he's saying, all right, trumpets, it's your turn to go, and all right, it's your turn now, and it's your turn. He is orchestrating this entire thing. He's behind the scenes. It seems like he's not there, but he's really in charge the whole time. And that, by the way, is the message that Israel needs. Because what is being prophesied about here seems like a terrible, devastating thing. And in fact, it really is quite devastating, quite awful what's going to be described here. And so much that twice during this vision, during the explanation of this vision, Daniel is going to absolutely faint. He's just going to all out faint right in front of Gabriel because he can't take it all. That's how terrible this is. It's going to look to the Jewish people like God isn't there. But really, he's behind the scenes orchestrating everything because God is in charge. He knows everything that's going to happen, and he's in charge of all of it. Nothing can happen but what he allows to happen. He's the one who says, all right, go ahead, your turn. All right, next thing. All right, come on, that's all right. God is the one in charge. Now, these things are things we must have when we go through difficulty as well. These are theological truths that become very practical when we walk through difficult times. Look at the difficult times, if you would, with me. We're going to see the interpretation of this vision. And this may take us some time, so we'll see. If we may have to do a second part, we'll see about that. Verse 17, so he came near to me where I was, and when he came, I was afraid and fell upon my face. But he said unto me, understand, O Son of Man, for at the time of the end shall be this vision. Now, we'll come back to that statement because I think that's an important statement. But let's move on to verse 18. Now as he was speaking with me, I was in deep sleep. Now that phrase literally means that as he continued to speak to him, Daniel just fainted. He just fell over. I've done this before, but it wasn't because I was talking to an angel. It's because I'm kind of queasy when I see blood, you know. And I went to visit someone in the hospital one time, and I locked my legs, I guess, wrong or something, and I was like, all right, I got to sit down real quick, you know. But this is not that. It's because he's talking to Gabriel, an angel, and he's just overwhelmed with what's going on. He's so shocked by all of this. that he faints. He says he was in a deep sleep on his face toward the ground all of a sudden, but he touched me and set me upright. And he said, he wakes him up. Angels have a habit of waking up humans, by the way. You remember Peter when he was in the prison, and the angel came and had to wake him up to break him out of prison? Well, I guess they're used to that. All right, so he says, he wakes him up, he gets him up. It says, verse 19, he said, "Behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation. For at the time appointed the end shall be. The ram which thou sawest having 2 horns are the kings of Media and Persia." Well, wow. That's a very accurate description of what happens to Media and Persia. Look at what he said about the ram. It says in verse 3, "I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other." Remember how Persia had conquered the Medes and gained control over them? And it says the other, and the higher came up last, which was exactly what took place. Remember that the Medes were in charge over the Persians until the Persians, under Cyrus the Great, pushed off the control of the Medes and conquered over the Medes, and they became the higher horn. They came up last. It says in verse 4, "I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward." He doesn't say eastward. Why is that? Because Persia had to conquer 3 great nations to become the empire that they became. It was first Babylon, that was to their west, and then they went north into what we call Turkey, which was Lydia, and then they went south into Egypt. It was westward, and then northward, and then southward. This was exactly the manner in which they would conquer the earth. The Media and Persia is, of course, what's being spoken about here. He says, "And the rough goat is the king of Grecia." Now this is something that there's no way that anybody writing during this time could have known other than by supernatural means. Because look at we are in 550 BC. This is when this chapter is taking place. And verse 5, it says, "As I was considering, behold, an he-goat came up from the west on the face of the whole ground, of the whole earth, and touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which he had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power." Now this was 334 BC. This was 200 years later. That a man named Alexander the Great came to be the king of Macedonia. And he united the Greeks, and they pushed back against the Persian Empire 200 years later. By the way, the Macedonians, they were known by what symbol, do you think? The goat. As a matter of fact, Alexander the Great was known as the goat. That was before football. And who is it? Tom Brady, the goat. Yeah, it wasn't because it stood for greatest of all time. That's not the reason. It's just because that was the symbol of Greece, the goat. And so here Daniel, 200 years before it happens, is predicting. No, he's not really predicting. It's God predicting in a dream and telling Daniel about it, that in 200 years, not only will the Persians conquer the whole world, but the Greeks will conquer them, and they'll do it. Look at what it says. The goat comes from the west on the face of the whole earth, which is, of course, where Greece is, but on the face of the whole earth, meaning he's going to conquer all of the Persian Empire. He touches not the ground, meaning he's moving so fast you can't even see his feet touch the ground. And by the way, Alexander the Great became king when he was 20, and by the time he was 33, he had conquered the Persians. In 13 years, and most of those years were spent solidifying his kingdom before he moved out against the Persians. It was really only about, not most of them, but the first several years, really only about 10 or 11 years that it took him to conquer the entire Persian Empire. It was lightning speed. That's what people know about Alexander the Great. Touched not the ground. He had a notable horn. There's no doubt that this is speaking about Alexander the Great, who is the notable ruler of Greece. And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, and I'd seen him before the river, and in the fury of his power, and I saw him come close unto the ram, and was moved with choler. By the way, no way Daniel could know this, but 200 years later, the reason the Greeks wanted to push back against the Persians is because the Persians had conquered many Greek city-states and had really angered the Greeks. They were very mad. As a matter of fact, some historians have looked at some of the battles and said, we don't understand how the Greeks could possibly have won this battle. They should have lost these battles, but they won just because they were so angry. They were just so filled with rage against the Persians, which is exactly what God predicted. Now, look back with me, if you would, at the interpretation of this. The rough goat is the king of Grecia, verse 21. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. That is, no doubt, Alexander the Great, without a question. Verse 22, now that being broken, whereas 4 stood up for it. 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. Now, if you're a historian and you're reading Daniel, this is where they say, no way this could have been written before the Greek Empire. Because there's no way he could have predicted that not only would the Greeks conquer the Persians, but that they would split into 4 empires after this. Because what happened when Alexander the Great died, he died rather suddenly. They say he was poisoned, or maybe he got sick from bad wine or something like that. But one way or another, he died very suddenly. And all he had said to people who asked him who was going to reign after him was, well, the strongest person will reign. So his generals began warring, and he had more than just 4 generals. He had lots of generals. And they started warring over who's going to be what. And one guy rose and tried to take the whole kingdom, but then somebody undermined him, and they didn't trust him, and then this happened, and then that happened. If you want to read about it, you can go ahead and read about it, but it's going to take a long time. Take your time reading through all of this. But the manner in which God accomplished the fulfillment of this prophecy is mind-blowing. There are a bazillion different ways this could have turned out, but the way it turned out was that the Greek Empire ended up being split into 4 kingdoms. There were 4 men, Ptolemy, or they call him Ptolemy. I call him Ptolemy because he got the P in the middle before his name. Ptolemy and Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Cassander, and those 4 generals split up the Greek Empire into 4 pieces. No way that's not God. There's no way. That's a supernatural prophecy that couldn't possibly have been written before, but yet we know it was written before it happened. Let's continue on. It says that it'll be split into 4 kingdoms. And in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up, and his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. And he shall destroy wonderfully, and he shall prosper and practice, and shall destroy mightily, and shall destroy the mighty and holy and the holy people. Now this is telling us that this king is going to come out of one of the branches of the Greek Empire, and he's going to destroy God's people. He's going to harm them in great ways. Look at what it says about it in the vision, because that's the interpretation. Now that we know that, look at what it says, verse 9. Out of one of those horns it came up forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south and toward the east and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. There is no doubt that this is speaking about a man named Antiochus. He called himself Antiochus Epiphanes. Some pronounce it Antiochus, whatever you want. Doesn't matter to me. Antiochus or Antiochus Epiphanes. This guy, the Bible says that he comes with subtlety. And this is exactly what's taking place. He actually was not in line for the king. That's why, for the kingship, he was not, his brother was in line to be king. And because his brother was in line to be king, the Romans, who were rising to power at the time, took Antiochus to Rome and held him there. That was their way of controlling the Seleucid Empire of the Greeks. If you guys try to attack us, we'll kill your brother. So since his brother was going to be the next king. Well, when his brother became the next king, Antiochus managed to, I don't know how he did this, but he managed to make a deal that swapped him for his brother's oldest son, who would be the next king. And so they swapped. Now Antiochus is free, and the next guy who's supposed to be king is held in Rome. And then what happens is his brother, who is the king, mysteriously dies. Just mysteriously. Nobody really knows exactly what happened. But he dies mysteriously. And the one general tries to claim the kingship, and Antiochus says, no, it should be my brother's son, but not the son who's in Rome. He picks his infant son who is just born. And he says, well, since he can't rule, I'll have to rule alongside of him. And so he rules as co-regent with his infant nephew until 5 years later, his infant nephew mysteriously dies. And then who rules the kingdom? Well, it is Antiochus, who's now stolen the kingdom of the Seleucids. Now, this is how this man rose to power, and it also tells you a little bit about his character. He called himself Epiphanes because he thought himself to be an epiphany. He thought himself to be a manifestation of Zeus. He was Zeus in human flesh. He thought he was God. In fact, he thought he was God, and he was so irritated with people who didn't also think he was God, who wouldn't at least give lip service to the fact that he was God. And so he had a real problem with the Jews. Big problem. Why? Because the Jews only recognized one God. And so he marched into the land of the Jews, and he was going to make well, he did lots of things. Well, I'll give you a few summaries, but not only did he sell the high priest's office to the highest bidder, he even sold it one time to a guy named Menelaus, who wasn't even a Levite. Remember that the high priest of the Jews has to be a Levite. It's the Levitical priesthood. But he sold the high priest position to a guy who's from the tribe of Benjamin, not even a Levite. And then he got so angry with the Jews that he made the Jewish religion outlawed. He wanted to bring those who refuse everything in the law those are the good Jews, and the bad Jews are the ones who are following the law of God. So he made it illegal for you to circumcise your son. Jewish women would, if they found out that they circumcised their son, their child would be killed, would be draped around their neck, they would be marched through the street and then thrown off of a cliff with their dead baby around their neck. I mean, they offered swine on the altar in Jerusalem. They actually offered an unclean animal on the altar, and they made it illegal to not eat pork. They would actually kill people in the worst imaginable ways. There's a whole host of different torture devices that we can read about in history, what they used to torture Jews who refused to eat pork, who refused to break the law in the Old Testament law of God. Over and over and over again, we see examples of this, but this was the manner in which he persecuted the Jews. Now let's read what it says about him in this vision. It says, out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south and toward the east. By the way, he was the king of the Seleucid Empire, which already controlled the Babylonian in the west, the eastern part. So he waxed great toward the east and toward the south. He warred mostly with the Ptolemies, which were in Egypt, the southern part. And that's why he had to cross through Israel so many times to get there. It says that he waxed great toward the south and toward the east and toward the pleasant land. That's Israel, no doubt. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host, meaning he's casting down some of these Jewish people. It says they're called stars. They're supposed to be shining the light of God to the whole world, right? But he's casting them down to the ground, stamping upon them, which is clearly what he did. And he magnified himself to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. It's true, they could not sacrifice in the temple anymore because the high priest was not a Levite, and they had offered pig's blood on the altar. So a host was given to him against the daily sacrifice. This seems to be referring to the Jewish people who actually followed him. Not all of them did, but some of them did. And they seem to be the host that's given to him against the daily sacrifice, meaning they were following this Menelaus guy who wasn't even a legitimate priest by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. Get this, it says the host was given to him. By who? God. Because nothing happens that God does not allow. God is allowing this. He is allowing the false Jews, if you will, the ones who aren't following the law, to be given to this Antichrist figure. Now, he's not the Antichrist, but he's certainly a figure of the Antichrist. He is an anti-God who claims to be God. The Jewish people began calling him Antiochus, not Epiphanes, but Epimanes, which means the madman, because he was actually insane. And he was killing them. But here it is, God's behind the whole thing. And we wonder when we see ourselves in darkness and in tribulation and in trouble, we wonder, where is God in all of this? Well, he's the one who's put us there. He's the one who's allowed it. We've seen now that God is, without a doubt, he knows all things. Without a doubt, he controls all things. And then we have to ask the question, why? Why? If God knows what's going to happen and he controls what's going to happen, why in the world would he allow this? And I think this brings us back to the statement here in verse 17. When Gabriel is explaining this vision, he says this, "So he came near where I stood. When he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said unto me, Understand, O Son of Man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision." This vision is not only a time during the Greek Empire, but Daniel is going to go on in the rest of the book to use it as a picture of a guy who's going to do something very similar in the end times, to prepare the way for the Messiah to come and destroy him. Now, this was all taking place about 100 to 200 years before Jesus returned. But remember what happened before Jesus came the first time. But remember what happened when Jesus came the first time? Remember who was there? It was these guys called the Pharisees. Where did the Pharisees come from? They came from a group of people called the Maccabees. The Maccabees were people who were zealous for the God of Israel during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. In fact, when they were forcing people to offer to a false Greek god on an altar, Matthias, who is the father of the Maccabees, he took out a spear and killed one of the Jewish people who went to go sacrifice to this false god. And then they tore down the altar and killed the Greek centurion or whatever they called him, who was enforcing this. And then they said, "Uh-oh, we're in trouble." So they ran to the mountains, formed a rebellion, took back the city of Jerusalem eventually, and then they purified the temple so it could be used again. By the way, that's where the ceremony of Hanukkah comes from. It's what Jesus was celebrating in the New Testament when it says he went to the Feast of Dedication. That was all because of the Maccabees. But it was from that revolution came the Pharisees, who were so zealous to follow the law of God that they wanted to make sure that they set huge guardrails to keep themselves from ever getting even close to breaking the law of God. This set the scene for the coming of Jesus. It actually prepared the way so that he would be rejected, mostly because of the Pharisees. And if Jesus hadn't been rejected, he wouldn't have died on the cross for our sins. And where would we be today? Do you see that God sees the end of these things? You see, right before Jesus returns again, there will be a man like this. We'll see this in the future chapters, who will do something similar, who will commit an abomination of desolation. And when he does, we must know that this is something God is doing because he sees the end. And we don't. We don't know what God is doing. We do know, however, that he's doing it. We do know that God knows all things and he controls all things, and that he makes choices because he sees more than we do. He makes his choices not for our benefit, but for his glory. That's the reason we're here, isn't it? We're not here for our glory. The greatest glory we'll ever have is when we get to heaven. That's not here. Man, the best thing that could possibly satisfy me and please me would be me going to heaven. But it wouldn't accomplish God's will, at least not at this moment. And so he has me here so I can glorify him, so I can do his will and not my own See? And if we look at troubles and tribulations as if they're just inhibiting us, they're keeping us from doing what we want to do, then they'll look like very bad things. But if we see them as things that allow God to work His glory in all things, then we say, that's a wonderful thing. It's not very comfortable, it's not very fun, it's not very happy, but it's wonderful because it makes my life filled with a purpose. And that purpose is not my own, it's the glory of God. And this is why theology is so important when we go through trouble. Because when we understand who God is and what He's doing, it helps us to understand all of the rest. That 2,300 days, by the way, it says in verse 14, He said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. We don't know the exact day when all of this happened, but we do know that it was in 165 or 164 BC, different people will count the date differently, when the sanctuary was cleansed by the Maccabees. And it was exactly 6 to 7 years before that, in 171 to 170 BC, when Menelaus, the guy who wasn't ever supposed to be the priest, became the high priest. It's the exact amount of time. We don't know the days, but it says here at the end, we'll read the last few verses of the chapter and close. Verse 25, and through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, meaning he's going to be very, very crafty, and he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall stand up against the prince of princes, that is certainly God, but he shall be broken without hand. And the vision of the evening and the morning, which was told, is true. Wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. By the way, the Antiochus did die, and he did die as a result of his own actions. And the vision of the evening and the mornings, which was told, is true, wherefore shut up. Meaning those 2,300 days, the evening and morning, literal 2,300 days, that's true. That's exactly correct, he says. And we see that it is exactly correct. It's the exact amount of time between when all of this started and when it ended. Verse 27, and I, Daniel, here's the second fainting, fainted and was sick certain days. Afterward I rose up and did the king's business, and I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. He says, I fainted. I can't believe that this is what God's plan is. But then after being sick for certain days, because it's not a pleasant thing, nobody's arguing that all of the things that God chooses to allow are pleasant and fun and good. Romans 8:28 does not say all things are good. It says all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to His purpose. We know that we can do as Daniel. We can look at the troubles and difficulties of our day. We can look at our country and the darkness that's coming on our nation. We can look at our personal trials and difficulties and sufferings, and we can say, with Daniel, it makes me sick. It makes me want to faint sometimes. But I know God is orchestrating the whole thing because He sees the end. And that really, I think, is where we find God in Daniel chapter 8. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we are a people who often find ourselves in troubles, in sufferings. We find comfort reading about suffering that's so far greater than ours. We realize that our suffering is nothing compared to the suffering we read about here of the children of Israel during the time of Antiochus. But to know that in all of that, you knew it, you controlled everything, you orchestrated everything, and you did it for a glorious purpose that we won't understand when we're in our difficulties and troubles, but we can trust you in it. And we thank you for that. Lord, my heart this morning is burdened for churches across our land where the Bible is not preached. Because when they go through difficulty, they don't know the God. They don't know the theology behind who God is and what He's doing and how wonderful and glorious that is, especially when we face times of trials. Lord, may we see this morning, may we in our hearts appreciate your goodness in the darkness. May we appreciate your goodness when the days when lies and evil prosper, even 6 years of prospering evil. May we see your hand in all of it. May we understand that it is by your hand that both evil and good comes to us, and that we can trust you in all of it. We thank you for it, Lord. Help us today. In Jesus' name.